They say accidents happen, but when they keep happening to the same person by the same hands, you start to wonder if the universe is trying to tell you something. Or maybe, just maybe, those accidents aren't so accidental after all. My name is Rachel Thompson, and for 16 years, I convinced myself that love meant making excuses for the inexcusable. But sometimes, the truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it, hidden behind passwords and buried in bank statements you were never supposed to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in our house on Maple Street. The autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold outside our kitchen window, and I was rushing around trying to get Tyler ready for school while Marcus sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone with that familiar frown etched across his face. At 42, my husband still had the rugged good looks that had first caught my attention at a college party 20 years ago, but lately, those same features seemed harder, more distant. I had been working part-time at Riverside Community College for the past 8 years, handling admissions paperwork and student inquiries. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money and gave me the flexibility to be home when Tyler got out of school. Marcus ran Thompson Construction, a business he'd built from nothing after we got married. On paper, we looked like the perfect, middle-class family living the American dream in small-town Oregon. But paper can be deceiving. "Mom, have you seen my chemistry textbook?" Tyler called from upstairs, his voice carrying that particular brand of teenage panic that meant he'd forgotten something important again. "Check your backpack," I called back, simultaneously buttering his toast and packing his lunch. "And don't forget you have soccer practice after school." Marcus looked up from his phone, irritation flashing in his dark eyes. "Can you keep it down? I'm trying to read something important here." The sharpness in his voice made me flinch, a reflexive response I'd developed over the years. "Sorry," I whispered automatically, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Making noise in my own kitchen at 7 in the morning seemed reasonable enough, but with Marcus, you never knew what might set him off. I moved more quietly around the kitchen, my bare feet making soft whispers against the tile floor. This was how our mornings usually went, me trying to be invisible while managing everything, Marcus acting like our family's daily routine was a personal inconvenience to him. Tyler had learned to navigate around his father's moods too, speaking in hushed tones and moving through the house like a ghost when Marcus was in one of his states. "Rachel," Marcus said without looking up from his phone, "I need you to transfer $500 from your account to mine today. The crew needs new equipment, and my business account is running low." My hand paused over Tyler's lunchbox. This had become a regular occurrence over the past year. Marcus asking for money from my personal savings with little explanation and no discussion. The first few times I'd asked questions about cash flow and business expenses. But those conversations always ended the same way, with Marcus getting defensive and me feeling guilty for not being more supportive of his work. "500?" I asked carefully, keeping my voice neutral. "That's quite a bit. Is everything okay with the business?" The look he gave me could have frozen water. "Are you questioning my judgment about my own company?" "No, of course not. You just what?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made me jump. "You just think you know better than me about construction work? About running a business?" My heart started beating faster, that familiar flutter of anxiety that happened whenever Marcus's voice took on that edge. "I didn't say that. I was just asking—" "You were just questioning me. Again." He stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back, my hip bumping against the counter. "Do you have any idea how hard I work to keep this family afloat? How much pressure I'm under every single day?" "I know you work hard," I said quietly, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for Tyler's lunch money on the counter. "I appreciate everything you do." "Do you?" His voice was getting louder now, and I could hear Tyler's footsteps on the stairs. My son didn't need to witness another one of these conversations. Because it doesn't feel like appreciation when my own wife questions every decision I make. I wanted to point out that asking about $500 wasn't unreasonable, that as his partner I had a right to understand our finances. But Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway, his chemistry textbook clutched against his chest, and his blue eyes wide with that look kids get when they sense tension between their parents. "Morning, Dad," he said carefully, his voice smaller than usual. Marcus's demeanor shifted instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The angry storm in his face cleared, replaced by a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, buddy. Ready for that chemistry test?" "Yeah, I think so." Tyler glanced between us, clearly picking up on the lingering tension in the room. I forced my own smile, determined to keep the morning normal for my son. "Your lunch is ready, sweetheart. And don't forget your soccer cleats are in the mudroom." As Tyler gathered his things, Marcus moved behind me to pour himself another cup of coffee. I was focused on zipping up Tyler's backpack when I felt his hand on my lower back, seemingly gentle and supportive. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an affectionate gesture from a loving husband. But then his fingers found the exact spot where he'd grabbed me 3 days earlier, pressing down on the bruise that was still tender and purple beneath my sweater. The pain shot through me like electricity, sharp and unmistakable. I gasped involuntarily, my body tensing as I fought not to cry out. "Oops," Marcus murmured against my ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry, honey. Didn't realize you were still sore from your fall." My fall. That's what we called it now. 3 days ago, during an argument about Tyler's expensive soccer equipment, Marcus had grabbed my arm so tightly that I'd lost my balance and hit the corner of the kitchen island. The bruise stretched from my shoulder blade to my spine, a map of purple and green that I'd been hiding under long sleeves and careful positioning. Tyler was still in the kitchen, thankfully focused on his phone and unaware of what had just happened. I bit down on my lip to keep from making any sound, my eyes watering from the sudden pain. "Mom, can you drive me to school today?" Tyler asked, looking up from his phone. "Jake's mom can't pick us up." "Of course," I managed, my voice only slightly strained. "Let me just grab my keys." Marcus moved away from me, that same false smile still plastered on his face. "Drive carefully," he said, and to anyone else it would have sounded like normal spousal concern. But I heard the underlying message, the reminder of all the ways things could go wrong, all the accidents that might happen. After Tyler and I left for school, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My brown hair was pulled back in its usual ponytail, and my hazel eyes looked tired despite the concealer I'd applied under them. At 39, I still looked relatively young, but there was something in my expression that hadn't been there in our wedding photos 16 years ago. A wariness, a constant state of alert that had become so normal I barely noticed it anymore. The drive home gave me time to think, something I'd been avoiding lately. When had this become my life? When had I started walking on eggshells in my own home, measuring my words and movements to avoid triggering Marcus's anger? The rational part of my brain knew this wasn't normal, wasn't healthy, but the other part, the part that had been slowly worn down over years of small incidents and subtle manipulation, whispered that maybe I was overreacting, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe this was just how marriage worked. Back home, I transferred the $500 Marcus had requested, watching my savings account balance drop with a familiar sick feeling in my stomach. This was the 3rd time this month he'd asked for money, and I was starting to worry about my own financial security. I'd been saving that money for Tyler's college fund, for emergencies, for the small sense of independence that having my own account provided. I tried to focus on work, answering emails and processing admissions applications from my home office, But my mind kept wandering to the conversation in the kitchen. The way Marcus had pressed on my bruise wasn't an accident. The positioning was too precise, the pressure too deliberate. He knew exactly where it hurt, and he'd chosen that moment when Tyler was in the room and I couldn't react, to remind me of it. This realization sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For years, I'd been explaining away the grabbing, the shoving, the times when Marcus's hands were a little too rough, or his grip a little too tight. I'd told myself he didn't know his own strength, that construction work had made him physical, that he never meant to hurt me. But this morning had stripped away that last layer of denial. He knew. He knew he was hurting me, and he was doing it on purpose. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mundane activities: laundry, grocery shopping, meal preparation. I moved through my routine like an actress playing a role, going through the motions of being a wife and mother while my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What did this mean for our marriage? What did it mean for Tyler? What was I supposed to do with this terrible new understanding? When Tyler came home from soccer practice, grass-stained and exhausted, I found myself studying his face for signs that he'd noticed anything wrong this morning. He seemed normal enough, chattering about his chemistry test and complaining about his coach's new training regimen, but I couldn't shake the worry that our problems were affecting him more than I realized. "Is Dad coming to my game on Saturday?" Tyler asked while doing his homework at the kitchen table. "I'm sure he'll try," I said, the automatic response I always gave when Tyler asked about his father's involvement in his activities. The truth was that Marcus attended Tyler's games sporadically, usually showing up long enough to be seen but leaving early if he got bored or distracted. "He missed the last two," Tyler said quietly, not looking up from his math worksheet. My heart ached for my son, who was trying so hard to act like it didn't matter whether his father showed up for him. "Well, this Saturday is different. It's the championship game." Tyler nodded, but I could see the doubt in his expression. He'd learned not to count on his father's promises, a lesson that no 16-year-old should have to master. Marcus came home late that evening, smelling like beer and claiming he'd been at a work dinner with potential clients. This had become his standard excuse for staying out late, and I'd stopped questioning it months ago. He was in a good mood, apparently having resolved whatever financial crisis had required my $500, and he spent a few minutes asking Tyler about his day before disappearing into his home office. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Marcus's steady breathing beside me, I found myself thinking about my sister Linda, who lived 2 hours away in Portland. Linda had always been suspicious of Marcus, though she'd never said anything directly. She had a way of looking at him during family gatherings that suggested she saw through his charming exterior to something darker underneath. During our last phone conversation, she'd asked me point blank if I was happy. It seemed like such a simple question, but I'd found myself stumbling over the answer, making excuses about the normal ups and downs of marriage and the stress of raising a teenager. Linda had listened to my rambling explanation in silence before saying quietly, "You know you can always come stay with me if you need to, right? No questions asked." At the time, I'd brushed off her offer as unnecessary worry from an overprotective, older sister. But lying there in the dark, with my back still aching from Marcus's deliberate touch that morning, Linda's words felt like a lifeline I wasn't ready to grab yet. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind cycling through memories and moments I'd previously dismissed or rationalized. The time Marcus had squeezed my wrist so hard during an argument that I'd had fingerprint bruises for a week. The way he positioned himself during disagreements, using his height and bulk to make me feel small and cornered. The calculated nature of his anger, how it always seemed to flare up when I questioned his decisions or expressed any independence. I thought about the other women in my life, My coworker Karen, who often complained about her husband's messiness but never mentioned being afraid of him. My friend Sarah from Tyler's soccer team, whose husband might be absent-minded but who never flinched when he reached for her. When had I started expecting pain from the man who was supposed to love and protect me? The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:47 a.m. when I finally gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to make tea. The house felt different in the quiet darkness, less like a home and more like a stage set waiting for the next performance. I sat at the kitchen table where just hours earlier Marcus had demanded money and hurt me with surgical precision, and I allowed myself to think the thought I'd been avoiding all day. This wasn't going to get better. Whatever this was, this pattern of control and casual cruelty, it was only going to escalate. I could continue making excuses and adapting to increasingly unacceptable behavior. Or I could acknowledge the truth about what my marriage had become. The truth was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I just wasn't sure yet if I had the courage to do it. As I sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, sipping my tea and listening to the old house settle around me, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start paying attention, really paying attention, to Marcus's behavior, his patterns, his lies. I was going to document everything, question everything, and most importantly, I was going to stop making excuses for the inexcusable. I had no idea that this decision would lead me to discoveries far worse than I'd ever imagined, hidden in places I'd never thought to look. But that morning, sitting alone in my kitchen with a bruise on my back and determination in my heart, I took the first step toward reclaiming my life. The accidents were about to become a lot less accidental. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of hyper-awareness, like someone had turned up the volume on every interaction between Marcus and me. I started noticing things I'd previously overlooked or dismissed, patterns that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The way he always seemed to bump into me when I was carrying something fragile, how his hand would find my arm during conversations, his grip just tight enough to be uncomfortable, but not quite enough to leave visible marks. The timing of his physical contact, always when Tyler was nearby or when we were in public places where I couldn't react without causing a scene. It was during this period of careful observation that I first noticed something odd about our finances. Marcus had always handled the bulk of our money management, claiming that his business experience made him better suited for budgeting and financial planning. I paid the household bills from my account and contributed to our joint savings, but the larger financial picture had always been his domain. Now, with my newfound attention to detail, I began to question why I'd been so willing to remain ignorant about our financial situation. The first red flag came when I was organizing our tax documents for our accountant. I needed to find Marcus's business income statements, which he usually kept in a file cabinet in his home office. He was out on a job site and Tyler was at school, so I had the house to myself. The office, which had once been our guest bedroom, was Marcus's sacred space. I rarely went in there, partly out of respect for his privacy, and partly because he'd made it clear over the years that he preferred to keep his work life separate from our family life. The file cabinet was locked, which seemed odd for someone organizing documents for tax preparation. I searched through his desk drawers for the key, feeling slightly guilty for snooping but justifying it as necessary for our taxes. When I finally found the key taped under the bottom drawer, my guilt transformed into curiosity. Why hide the key to documents that should be routine business records? Inside the cabinet, I found the expected files: invoices, receipts, client contracts. But I also found something that made my stomach drop. Bank statements for an account I'd never heard of, with a balance that made my eyes water. The account, held at a bank across town where we'd never done business, contained over $40,000. The monthly statements went back 3 years, showing regular deposits that coincided with the times Marcus had asked me for money from my personal savings. My hands shook as I flipped through the statements, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. While I'd been transferring hundreds of dollars from my modest savings account to help with his business expenses, Marcus had been accumulating a significant nest egg in an account I didn't even know existed. The deposits weren't just from his business either. There were transfers from our joint account, money that should have been going toward Tyler's college fund and our retirement savings. I photographed several of the statements with my phone, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid I might pass out. This wasn't just financial secrecy, it was outright deception. Marcus had been systematically draining our shared resources while building his own private fortune, all while convincing me that money was tight and that my contributions were necessary to keep us afloat. But the hidden bank account was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into the files, I found credit card statements for cards I'd never seen, with charges that painted a picture of a life I knew nothing about. Expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, hotel rooms booked on nights when Marcus claimed to be working late, jewelry purchases that had never appeared around my neck or on my fingers. The most damning evidence was a folder, labeled property documents that contained paperwork for a small rental property Marcus apparently owned on the other side of town. The property had been purchased 2 years ago, around the same time he'd convinced me to take out a second mortgage on our house to help expand his business. The rental income from the property, according to the documents, was substantial enough to cover the mortgage payments on our family home with money left over. I sat in Marcus's office chair, surrounded by evidence of his deception, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about hidden money or secret purchases. This was about the systematic way Marcus had been lying to me for years, manipulating our finances while making me feel guilty for questioning anything. Every time I'd worried about our budget, every time I'd transferred money from my savings, every time I'd felt anxious about our financial future, Marcus had been sitting on this secret wealth. The sound of his truck in the driveway sent me into a panic. I quickly photographed the remaining important documents, returned everything to its proper place, and locked the file cabinet. By the time Marcus walked through the front door, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, my face carefully composed to hide the storm raging inside me. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my cheek in a gesture that now felt like performance art. "Fine," I managed, focusing on chopping vegetables, with more intensity than necessary. "How was the job site?" "Exhausting. The client keeps changing his mind about the kitchen layout." Marcus loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, watching me cook with an expression that seemed more calculating than affectionate. "I might need to stay late tomorrow to finish the project. Probably won't be home until after Tyler's bedtime." Another lie, I realized. How many times had he used work as an excuse for his absence? How many late nights and weekend projects had actually been cover for whatever he was doing with his secret money and hidden life? "That's too bad," I said evenly. "Tyler was hoping you could help him with his college application essays." Marcus's face darkened slightly. "College applications are expensive, you know. We might need to look at community college options instead of those fancy universities he's been talking about." The audacity of this statement, coming from a man sitting on $40,000 in hidden assets, nearly made me laugh out loud. Instead, I nodded sympathetically and continued cooking, filing away yet another example of his manipulation. That night, after Marcus had gone to sleep, I lay awake analyzing every conversation we'd had about money over the past few years. His insistence that we couldn't afford family vacations while he was buying investment property. His complaints about Tyler's sports equipment costs while he was dining at expensive restaurants with unknown companions. His lectures about my spending habits while he maintained secret credit cards for his personal use. The pattern was clear once I started looking for it. Marcus had been gaslighting me about our financial situation for years, making me feel guilty for wanting things while he secretly hoarded resources for himself. Every argument about money, every time I'd felt selfish for wanting to spend on Tyler or myself, every moment I doubted my own financial judgment, it had all been orchestrated to keep me compliant and dependent. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to Marcus's schedule and his explanations for his whereabouts. I started tracking his lies in a small notebook I kept hidden in my car, documenting the discrepancies between what he told me and what I could verify. The pattern that emerged was both enlightening and devastating. Marcus had essentially been living a double life. While presenting himself as a struggling small business owner to his family, he'd been operating as a successful entrepreneur with multiple income streams and significant assets. The late nights and weekend work sessions were often cover for activities that had nothing to do with construction. The financial strain he constantly complained about was fiction designed to keep me from asking questions about our real financial situation. The emotional manipulation was just as calculated as the financial deception. Marcus had trained me over the years to accept his version of reality without question, to feel guilty for having needs or desires that might cost money, to see myself as a burden on the family finances rather than a contributing partner. He'd used my love for Tyler and my desire to be a supportive wife as weapons against my own financial security. I started researching financial abuse online, reading articles and forum posts that made my skin crawl with recognition. The stories were depressingly similar. Partners who controlled money through lies and manipulation, who made their spouses feel financially dependent while secretly building personal wealth, who used economic pressure as a form of control within the relationship. One article in particular struck me with its description of financial abuse as a form of domestic violence that often escalated over time. The author explained how financial control was frequently paired with other forms of abuse, creating a web of dependency that made it difficult for victims to leave even when they recognized the unhealthy patterns. Reading that article was like looking in a mirror. Marcus's financial deception wasn't separate from his physical intimidation and emotional manipulation. It was all part of the same system of control. He'd been systematically undermining my independence and security while building his own escape route, all while making me feel grateful for his provision and guilty for questioning his methods. The realization that I was a victim of domestic abuse was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant I wasn't crazy or overreacting to his behavior. Terrifying because it meant my situation was more dangerous than I'd allowed myself to believe. I began making my own plans, carefully and quietly. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, one where Marcus had no access and no knowledge of its existence. I started redirecting a small portion of my paycheck to this account, money that would be truly mine in case I needed it, for an emergency. I also began gathering copies of important documents, Tyler's birth certificate, our marriage license, my passport, insurance policies, and storing them in a safety deposit box Marcus didn't know about. My sister Linda called. During this period, her voice warm and familiar across the phone line. We talked about Tyler's upcoming soccer tournament and her latest work project, the kind of comfortable conversation that made me realize how much I missed having someone in my life who genuinely cared about my well-being without expecting anything in return. "You sound tired," Linda observed near the end of our call. "Are you getting enough sleep?" The question, innocent as it was, nearly broke my composure. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being without it being a prelude to asking for something else? When was the last time I'd had a conversation that wasn't filled with the careful navigation required to avoid triggering Marcus's anger or suspicion? "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I'd trained myself to give whenever anyone expressed concern. "Just busy with work and Tyler's activities." "Rachel," Linda said gently, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's wrong, if you need help with anything, I'm here." For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The hidden accounts, the deliberate bruises, the years of lies and manipulation I was only beginning to understand. But something held me back. Perhaps the habits of secrecy Marcus had trained into me. or the fear that speaking the truth out loud would make it too real to take back. "I know," I said instead. "Thank you. I love you too." After we hung up, I sat in my car outside the grocery store and cried for the first time in months. Not the silent, hidden tears I'd learned to shed in private moments, but the kind of deep, cleansing sobs that come from finally acknowledging a truth you've been avoiding. I cried for the years I'd lost to Marcus's manipulation, for the woman I'd been before I learned to make myself smaller to accommodate his ego, for the future I was only beginning to imagine might be possible. But I also cried with relief. For the first time in years, I had a clear picture of my situation and a plan for changing it. I wasn't helpless or trapped, despite Marcus's efforts to make me feel that way. I had skills, resources, and people who cared about me. I had evidence of his deception and documentation of his abuse. Most importantly, I had finally stopped making excuses for the inexcusable. The woman who had blindly transferred money to her husband's account just a few weeks earlier was gone. In her place was someone who understood that love shouldn't require you to ignore your own instincts, that marriage shouldn't feel like a constant performance, and that financial partnership meant transparency and respect, not secrecy and manipulation. Marcus had no idea that his carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling, that his victim was becoming his adversary. He continued his routine of demands and deceptions, unaware that I was documenting everything, planning everything, preparing for the day when his accidents would finally have consequences. That day was coming sooner than he thought. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but once I started seeing Marcus clearly, I couldn't unsee what had been in front of me all along. Every interaction became a case study in manipulation. Every conversation a masterclass in gaslighting. The man I'd married had been replaced by a stranger, or perhaps the stranger had always been there, and I'd simply been too trusting to notice. My new awareness extended beyond finances into every aspect of our relationship. I began to see how Marcus controlled the narrative of our marriage, how he positioned himself as the long-suffering provider, and me as the grateful beneficiary of his hard work. He had a way of rewriting history that made me question my own memories, turning my legitimate concerns into evidence of my ingratitude or instability. The night everything crystallized was a Friday in early November. Tyler was sleeping over at a friend's house, and Marcus had come home from what he claimed was a client dinner smelling like expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. When I casually asked about his evening, mentioning that the perfume scent was lovely, his reaction was swift and telling. "What perfume?" he demanded, his voice immediately defensive. "I don't smell like anything except construction dust and exhaustion." I could have let it go, could have retreated into the familiar pattern of doubting my own perceptions. Instead, I stood my ground. "There's definitely perfume, Marcus. It's quite strong, actually. Floral? Maybe jasmine?" His face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, then anger. "Are you accusing me of something, Rachel? Because if you are, just say it instead of playing these passive-aggressive games." The accusation of passive aggression was rich coming from a man who'd been conducting psychological warfare for years, but I kept my voice calm. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just mentioning what I smell. If there's an innocent explanation, I'd love to hear it." Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might resort to physical intimidation. Instead, he chose a different weapon. "You know what, Rachel? You've been acting strange lately, suspicious, paranoid. Maybe you should talk to someone about that. It's not healthy to constantly question your husband's every move." The gaslighting was so blatant, it was almost laughable. Here was a man with secret bank accounts and hidden assets, accusing me of being paranoid for noticing perfume on his clothes. The sheer audacity of it would have been impressive if it weren't so cruel. "You're right," I said, surprising him with my agreement. "I should talk to someone. Maybe I'll make an appointment with Dr. Henderson next week." Dr. Henderson was our family physician, someone Marcus respected because of his golf handicap and expensive car. The suggestion that I might discuss my concerns with a medical professional clearly rattled Marcus, though he tried to hide it. "That's not what I meant," he backtracked. "You don't need to involve outsiders in our marriage. We can work through this ourselves." But it was too late. I'd already decided that it was time to stop handling things ourselves. Marcus had forfeited the right to privacy and trust when he'd started building his secret life with our shared resources. That weekend, while Marcus was supposedly working on an urgent project, I began my most thorough investigation yet. I started with his computer, which he'd always kept password protected. It took me several attempts, but I finally gained access. Using a combination of Tyler's birthday and our wedding anniversary, painfully predictable passwords for a man who thought himself so clever. What I found on that computer changed everything. Marcus hadn't just been hiding money. He'd been living an entirely separate existence. His email accounts told the story of a man who presented himself as single to a rotating cast of women he met through dating apps and social media. The photos he used were carefully cropped versions of our family pictures, editing me and Tyler out of the frame to create the illusion of bachelorhood. The messages were nauseating to read. Marcus, who barely managed a kind word to me anymore, was charming and attentive to these other women. He took them to expensive restaurants I'd only seen in magazines, bought them jewelry that cost more than my monthly salary, planned elaborate weekend getaways that he funded with money he'd convinced me we didn't have. One email chain was particularly devastating. It was with a woman named Amanda, who worked at the bank where Marcus kept his secret account. She'd clearly been helping him manage his financial deception, providing insider information about hiding assets and structuring transactions to avoid detection. Their relationship was both personal and professional, a partnership built on duplicity that had been going on for over 2 years. In one message, Amanda referred to me as the wife situation and suggested that Marcus considered divorcing me before. I became suspicious of his financial activities. His response made my blood run cold. R is too trusting to figure anything out, and too dependent to leave even if she did. I've got years before I need to worry about an exit strategy. Reading. Those words felt like being punched in the stomach. The casual cruelty of reducing me to a problem to be managed, the confidence that I was too stupid and powerless to threaten his schemes. It was breathtaking in its arrogance. Marcus had been living his life as if I were a piece of furniture, something to work around rather than a partner deserving of honesty and respect. But perhaps the most infuriating discovery was a folder labeled insurance documents that contained a life insurance policy I'd never heard of. Marcus had taken out a substantial policy on my life 6 months earlier, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The application contained false information about my health and lifestyle, including claims about drinking and depression that would have made the policy invalid if the insurance company knew the truth. The implications were terrifying. A man, who had been deliberately injuring me while making it look accidental, had secretly bet on my death. The pattern of accidents took on a much more sinister meaning when viewed alongside a hidden life insurance policy. What had seemed like garden-variety domestic abuse suddenly looked like something much more dangerous. I photographed everything: the emails, the financial documents, the insurance policy, the evidence of his double life. Each image felt like building a case, preparing for a trial where the defendant had no idea he was being investigated. My hands shook as I worked, but my resolve only grew stronger with each new revelation. The scope of Marcus's deception was staggering. He'd been systematically robbing our family while building wealth for himself and his girlfriend. He'd been presenting himself as single while married, available while committed, struggling while prosperous. Every aspect of his public persona was a carefully constructed lie designed to serve his interests at everyone else's expense. When Marcus returned home that evening, I was cooking dinner as if nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day, the same routine we'd followed for years, but now I could see it for what it was: a performance designed to maintain the facade of normalcy while he continued his betrayal. "Tyler called," I told him, stirring the pasta sauce with careful attention. "He wants to know if you're coming to his game tomorrow." "Of course I'll be there," Marcus said, though I'd already seen the email he'd sent to Amanda about a weekend trip they were planning. "Wouldn't miss it." Another lie, as casual as breathing. I wondered how many of Tyler's events Marcus had missed while pursuing his secret relationships, how many promises to his son had been broken for the sake of maintaining his double life. "That's wonderful," I said. "He's been working so hard this season. It would mean a lot to him." Marcus nodded absently, already focused on his phone. Probably checking messages from Amanda or one of his other women, planning his next deception while sitting at our kitchen table eating food I'd prepared with money he'd stolen from our joint accounts. That night, after Marcus had gone to sleep, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. I was going to consult with a divorce attorney, not because I'd definitely decided to leave, but because I needed to understand my options and protect my interests. Marcus had been planning his exit strategy for years while keeping me in the dark about our true financial situation. It was time for me to develop my own strategy. I also decided to visit Dr. Henderson, not because I believed Marcus's gaslighting about my mental health, but because I needed medical documentation of the injuries Marcus had been inflicting. If his accidents escalated, if the life insurance policy represented more than just financial opportunism, I wanted a paper trail that would protect Tyler and hold Marcus accountable. The next morning, I called Dr. Henderson's office and made an appointment for the following week. When the receptionist asked about the reason for the visit, I said I needed to discuss some ongoing health concerns and relationship stress. It felt like the first honest conversation I'd had in months. I also researched divorce attorneys in the area, looking for someone with experience in cases involving financial fraud and domestic abuse. The consultations would be expensive, but I'd started to think of them as investments in my future security, rather than costs I couldn't afford. Marcus did skip Tyler's soccer game, texting at the last minute about an emergency at a job site. Tyler tried to hide his disappointment, but I could see the hurt in his eyes as he scanned the bleachers looking for his father. I cheered loud. Enough for both parents, taking pictures and videos that Marcus would later claim to have been too busy to attend to. That evening, Tyler and I had dinner alone, while Marcus was supposedly dealing with his work emergency. My son was quieter than usual, picking at his food while stealing glances at his father's empty chair. "Mom," he said finally, "why doesn't Dad ever keep his promises anymore?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Tyler had been watching and learning from his father's behavior, absorbing lessons about how men treat their families and what marriage looked like. I realized that by staying silent about Marcus's treatment of me, I'd been teaching my son that this kind of behavior was normal and acceptable. "Sometimes adults make promises they can't keep," I said carefully, not wanting to badmouth his father, but also not wanting to make excuses for inexcusable behavior. "But that doesn't mean it's okay, and it doesn't mean you should expect that from people who love you." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "Is that why you've been sad lately? Because Dad breaks his promises?" The perceptiveness of the question caught me off guard. I'd thought I'd been hiding my emotional state from Tyler, but clearly my 16-year-old son was more observant than I'd given him credit for. "I haven't been sad exactly," I said, choosing my words carefully. "More like figuring some things out. Sometimes when you're an adult, you realize that things you thought were one way are actually different, and you have to decide what to do about that." "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" The question was direct and fearless, delivered with the kind of brutal honesty that only teenagers can manage. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the little boy who needed protection from adult problems, but a young man who deserved honesty about his family situation. He'd been living with the tension and dysfunction just as much as I had, probably understanding more than I'd realized. "I don't know yet," I said finally. "But if we do, it won't be your fault. And it won't change how much I love you or how much your father loves you." Tyler nodded again, seeming relieved to finally have an honest conversation about what he'd been observing. "Would we have to move?" "I don't know that either," I admitted. "But whatever happens, I'll make sure you're okay. That's my job as your mom, and it's the most important thing in the world to me." We finished dinner in comfortable silence, and I realized that honesty, even partial honesty, felt better than the careful pretense I'd been maintaining for months. Tyler deserved better than growing up thinking that Marcus's behavior was normal or acceptable. He deserved to see what it looked like when someone stood up for themselves and demanded respect. That night, as I lay in bed next to my sleeping husband, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Marcus had made his choices to lie, to steal, to betray, to manipulate. Now it was time for me to make mine. I was done being a victim of his deception. I was done making excuses for his behavior. I was done protecting him from the consequences of his actions. The scared, uncertain woman who had discovered those first bank statements was evolving into someone Marcus wouldn't recognize. Someone who asked questions instead of accepting explanations. Someone who documented evidence instead of ignoring red flags. Someone who was finally ready to fight for herself and her son. Marcus thought he had years before he needed to worry about an exit strategy. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. The appointment with Dr. Henderson went better than I'd expected. When I arrived at his office on Tuesday morning, I'd prepared myself for skepticism or dismissal, but instead found a physician who listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. I'd brought photos of the bruises Marcus had given me over the past few months, images I'd been taking on my phone whenever I noticed new marks or tender spots. Dr. Henderson examined the photos with professional detachment, but I could see the concern growing in his expression as he documented each injury. The bruise patterns were telling a story that no medical professional could ignore. Finger marks on my arms, pressure points on my back, injuries that were clearly caused by deliberate force rather than accidents. "Rachel," he said gently after completing his examination and documentation, "these injuries are consistent with intentional harm. I'm legally required to ask, are you safe at home?" The question hung in the air between us. For so long, I'd convinced myself that I was safe enough, that Marcus's violence was controlled and predictable. But the life insurance policy had changed my calculations entirely. A man who secretly bet on his wife's death while systematically injuring her wasn't someone who could be trusted to maintain boundaries. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I need help figuring that out." Dr. Henderson nodded and pulled out a business card from his desk drawer. "This is Maria Santos. She's a social worker who specializes in domestic violence situations. She can help you assess your safety and develop a plan if you decide you need one." I took the card, feeling like I was crossing another threshold. Each step toward getting help felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. "Will this conversation be confidential?" "Absolutely. Patient confidentiality protects our discussion. But Rachel, if you're in immediate danger, please don't hesitate to call 911 or go to the emergency room. We can help you there too." I promised to contact Maria Santos and left the doctor's office with official medical documentation of my injuries, and a growing sense that I wasn't alone in this situation. There were people trained to help women like me, systems in place to protect victims of domestic violence. I just had to be brave enough to use them. My consultation with divorce attorney Patricia Chen was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I'd chosen her office carefully, selecting someone across town where Marcus was unlikely to have connections. The consultation fee was $200, money I took from my secret account without guilt. After discovering the extent of Marcus's financial deception, I'd stopped feeling guilty about spending money on my own protection and planning. Patricia Chen was a small woman with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. Her office was decorated with diplomas and awards, evidence of a career spent helping people navigate the legal complexities of ending marriages. When I explained my situation, she listened without judgment while taking detailed notes. "You've been very smart to document everything," she said after I'd shown her copies of the financial records and explained the pattern of physical intimidation. Financial fraud in a marriage is serious, and combined with domestic violence, it gives us significant leverage in divorce proceedings. She explained the legal process for asset discovery, how we could use court orders to uncover all of Marcus's hidden accounts and properties. The rental property, the secret bank accounts, the fraudulent insurance policy, everything would have to be disclosed during the divorce process, and Marcus's attempts to hide assets would work against him. "What about Tyler?" I asked. "How would custody work given everything that's happened?" Patricia's expression grew serious. The domestic violence is a significant factor in custody decisions. Courts prioritize the safety of children, and a pattern of violence against one parent raises concerns about the other parent's fitness. We'd need to document everything carefully, but you'd likely have a strong case for primary custody. The conversation lasted over an hour, covering topics I'd never imagined needing to understand: restraining orders, asset protection, emergency custody arrangements, the timeline for filing and serving papers. By the end, I had a clear picture of what divorce would look like and the steps I'd need to take to protect Tyler and myself. "My advice," Patricia said as our consultation ended, "is to continue documenting everything while you decide how you want to proceed. Don't let Marcus know you're considering divorce until you're ready to file. Men who engage in financial fraud and domestic violence can become dangerous when they realize they're losing control." I left her office with a folder full of information and a retainer agreement I could sign when I was ready to begin the legal process. The consultation had been empowering and terrifying in equal measure. I now knew exactly how to end my marriage and protect my interests, but I also understood that taking that step would likely trigger Marcus's worst behavior. That evening, Marcus came home in an unusually good mood, humming while he loosened his tie and asking about my day with more interest than he'd shown in months. I wondered if his cheerfulness was related to whatever he'd been doing with Amanda, or one of his other women, but I kept my suspicions to myself. "Tyler's got that college fair next week," I mentioned while we cleaned up after dinner. "Have you thought about which schools you'd like him to consider?" Marcus's mood shifted subtly, the way it always did when conversations turned to expenses. He couldn't control. "College is expensive, Rachel. We need to be realistic about what we can afford." The irony of this statement from a man sitting on tens of thousands of hidden dollars was almost overwhelming. Marcus had been sabotaging our family's financial security while lecturing me about fiscal responsibility, undermining Tyler's future while building his own escape fund. "Community college isn't a bad option," he continued. "Tyler could live at home, save money, maybe transfer to a 4-year school later." I watched my husband systematically limiting our son's opportunities while secretly maintaining the resources to provide him with any education he wanted, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. This wasn't just about Marcus lying to me anymore. This was about him stealing Tyler's future while pretending to be a responsible father making difficult financial decisions. "We should look at all the options," I said carefully. "Tyler's worked hard. He deserves to have choices." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Deserve doesn't pay tuition bills, Rachel. We have to live in the real world." His version of the real world, apparently, was one where Tyler's education was expendable, but Marcus's secret lifestyle was essential. Where family resources were too limited for college tuition, but sufficient for expensive dinners with other women. Where a mother's concern for her child's future was unrealistic, but a father's financial betrayal was justified. That night, I Made copies of all the evidence I'd gathered and stored them in my safety deposit box. Bank statements, email printouts, photographs of injuries, documentation from Dr. Henderson, everything that would be needed to prove Marcus's deception and abuse. I also withdrew additional cash from my secret account and hid it in various places throughout the house, money that would be accessible if I needed to leave quickly. The weekend brought Tyler's soccer tournament, the championship game that Marcus had promised to attend. I arrived early to claim good seats, setting up my folding chair and preparing to cheer for my son regardless of whether his father showed up. Tyler spotted me in the stands and waved, his smile bright despite the empty space beside me where Marcus should have been sitting. 15 minutes before game time, Marcus appeared, looking harried and checking his phone constantly. He'd clearly come straight from somewhere else, his clothes wrinkled and his hair mussed in a way that suggested recent intimate activity. The familiar scent of perfume clung to him, the same floral fragrance I'd noticed weeks earlier. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "Work crisis?" I nodded without responding, my attention focused on Tyler warming up with his teammates. Marcus's presence felt performative, like he was checking a box rather than genuinely wanting to support his son. He spent most of the first half of the game on his phone, only looking up when other parents cheered or when Tyler made a particularly impressive play. During halftime, Marcus stepped away to take a phone call, walking far enough from the stands that I couldn't hear his conversation. Through the chain-link fence, I could see him gesturing animatedly, his body language suggesting intimacy rather than business. When he returned, he announced that he'd have to leave early due to another work emergency. "Can't someone else handle it?" I asked, knowing the answer but wanting to see how he'd justify abandoning Tyler's championship game. "Not this time," Marcus said, already gathering his things. "Tell Tyler I'm proud of him, win or lose." He left during the third quarter, missing Tyler's game-winning goal and the team's celebration afterward. I cheered and took pictures, documenting another milestone that Tyler would remember as something his father missed for work. When Tyler found me after the game, his medal gleaming around his neck, his first question was about where his dad had gone. "Work emergency," I said, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. "But he said to tell you he's proud of you." Tyler nodded, his disappointment carefully hidden behind the practiced smile of a child who'd learned not to expect too much from his father. We drove home in companionable silence, Tyler's trophy sitting between us like a symbol of everything Marcus was missing while chasing his secret life. That evening, while Tyler was at a post-game celebration with his teammates, I confronted Marcus about his early departure. Not because I expected honesty, but because I wanted to see how creative his lies had become. "What was so urgent that you had to miss Tyler's championship game?" I asked, keeping my tone curious rather than accusatory. Marcus launched into an elaborate story about a client emergency, a foundation problem that required immediate attention, workers who needed supervision to prevent costly mistakes. The details were specific and convincing, the kind of lie that had fooled me for years. But now I could see the construction for what it was, a carefully built fabrication designed to hide his actual activities. "That sounds stressful," I said sympathetically. "Did you get it resolved?" "Eventually," Marcus said, settling into his recliner with a beer. "But it took hours. I hate that I missed Tyler's game, but sometimes work has to come first." The casual way he prioritized his fictional work crisis over his son's real achievement was breathtaking. Marcus had developed such facility with lying that he could express regret for missing Tyler's game while simultaneously justifying his choice to leave. He'd convinced himself that his deception was reasonable, that his family should understand and accept his priorities without question. I excused myself and went to bed early, claiming exhaustion from the emotional ups and downs of the tournament. In reality, I needed space to process the day's events and plan my next moves. Marcus's behavior at the soccer game had crystallized something important for me. He wasn't just lying about money or having affairs, he was systematically choosing his secret life over his family responsibilities. Tyler deserved better than a father who treated his achievements as interruptions to more important activities. He deserved to see what it looked like when someone prioritized family over personal desires, when someone kept their promises and showed up for the people they claimed to love. More importantly, Tyler deserved to grow up understanding that relationships should be based on honesty and respect, not deception and manipulation. By staying with Marcus and accepting his behavior, I was teaching my son that this kind of treatment was normal and acceptable in a marriage. The thought of Tyler learning Marcus's relationship patterns, of potentially treating his own future partners the way Marcus treated me, was more motivating than any concern for my own well-being. I couldn't control what kind of father Marcus chose to be, but I could control what kind of example I set for handling unacceptable behavior. Monday morning, I called Maria Santos and scheduled an appointment for later that week. I also contacted Patricia Chen and asked her to prepare the divorce paperwork, though I wasn't ready to file yet. I wanted everything in place before I made my move, all the legal and practical pieces arranged so that when the time came, I could act decisively. The transformation was complete. The woman who had accepted Marcus's explanation for coming home, smelling like perfume, was gone, replaced by someone who documented his lies and planned strategic responses. I was no longer reacting to Marcus's behavior. I was preparing to end it permanently. Marcus had spent years building his web of deception, confident that I was too trusting and dependent to threaten his carefully constructed double life. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about the woman he'd underestimated for so long. The moment I decided to act came on a gray December morning when Marcus made a mistake that finally gave me the opening I'd been waiting for. He'd left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a text message from Amanda appeared on the locked screen. The preview was enough to make my heart race. Account transfer complete. New property closing scheduled for Friday. Can't wait to start our new life together. New property, new life together. The words confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Marcus wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to abandon his family entirely. The casual way Amanda discussed transferring accounts and closing on property made it clear that they'd been planning this escape for months, using money stolen from our marriage to fund their future together. I photographed the message and added it to my growing collection of evidence. Then I called Patricia Chen's office and scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon. The time for preparation was over. It was time to act before Marcus could execute whatever exit strategy he'd been developing with his accomplice. Patricia reviewed the new evidence with obvious satisfaction. "This gives us everything we need," she said, spreading the documents across her desk. "Financial fraud, adultery, domestic violence, and now evidence of asset transfer with intent to defraud. We can get emergency injunctions to freeze all his accounts and prevent him from disposing of any more marital property." She explained that we could file for divorce and request emergency relief that very day. The court could issue temporary orders protecting me and Tyler, freezing Marcus's assets, and requiring him to maintain the status quo until the divorce was finalized. With the evidence we'd gathered, she was confident we could get everything we asked for. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out the life insurance documents I'd found on Marcus's computer. "He took out a policy on my life without my knowledge. Given everything else, I'm concerned about what he might be planning." Patricia's expression grew serious as she reviewed the insurance paperwork. "This changes the urgency level significantly. Combined with the pattern of physical abuse, this suggests potential escalation. We need to get you and Tyler to safety before we serve these papers." We spent the next 2 hours preparing the legal documents that would end my marriage and expose Marcus's deception. Petition for divorce, request for emergency protective orders, motions to freeze assets and prevent dissipation of marital property. Each form felt like a weapon being forged, legal instruments that would strip away Marcus's ability to continue his manipulation and fraud. Patricia also helped me prepare a safety plan. I would take Tyler to my sister Linda's house in Portland that evening, ostensibly for a pre-Christmas visit. The papers would be served to Marcus at his office the following morning, when he'd be surrounded by his employees and less likely to react violently. By the time he received the divorce petition, Tyler and I would be safely out of his reach. "Remember," Patricia cautioned as I prepared to leave her office, "men like Marcus often escalate when they realize they're losing control. Don't underestimate what he might do when he discovers you've been investigating him. Stay away from him until we can get the protective orders in place." I drove home with a mixture of terror and exhilaration coursing through my veins. After months of careful planning and documentation, I was finally taking action. The scared, compliant woman Marcus had trained me to be was about to disappear, replaced by someone who refused to be manipulated or abused any longer. Tyler was in his room doing homework when I arrived home. I knocked on his door and asked if I could come in, needing to have a conversation I'd been dreading for weeks. "How would you feel about spending a few days with Aunt Linda?" I asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. "She's been asking us to visit, and I thought it might be nice to get away for a little while." Tyler looked up from his textbook, his expression thoughtful. "Is this about you and Dad getting divorced?" His directness still surprised me, but I'd learned to appreciate his willingness to address difficult topics head-on. "Yes," I said simply. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow, and I want us to be somewhere safe while your father processes the news." "Safe?" Tyler's eyebrows rose. "Is Dad dangerous?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been trying to protect Tyler from understanding, but looking at my 16-year-old son, I realized he deserved honesty about why our family was falling apart. "Your father has been hurting me," I said carefully. Not in obvious ways, but in ways that made me feel scared and small. He's also been lying about money and having relationships with other women. I can't live like that anymore, and I don't want you to think that's how marriages are supposed to work. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he asked, "Have you been planning this for a while?" "Yes," I admitted. "I wanted to make sure I could protect both of us before I took action." He nodded slowly, then asked the question I'd been most afraid to hear. "Are you okay, Mom? Really okay?" The concern in his voice nearly broke my heart. My teenage son had been worrying about me, probably sensing the tension and fear I'd tried so hard to hide. He'd been watching his father's treatment of me and drawing his own conclusions about what was happening in our house. "I'm going to be okay," I said, meaning it for the first time in years. "We both are. But it might be difficult for a while as we figure out our new normal." Tyler packed a bag without complaint, and I could see relief in his movements. He'd been carrying the weight of our family's dysfunction just as much as I had, and the prospect of escape seemed to lighten his shoulders. As we loaded our suitcases into my car, I felt like we were refugees fleeing a war zone, finally heading toward safety. The drive to Portland took 3 hours, during which Tyler and I talked more honestly than we had in months. He told me about the anxiety he'd been feeling at home, the way he'd learned to gauge his father's moods and adjust his behavior accordingly. He'd been walking on eggshells just like I had, trying to avoid triggering Marcus's anger or criticism. "I'm proud of you for leaving," Tyler said as we pulled into Linda's driveway. "I know it must be scary." His maturity and understanding overwhelmed me. At 16, Tyler was already demonstrating more emotional intelligence and courage than his father had shown in years of marriage. Whatever mistakes I'd made as a mother, I'd apparently raised a son who understood the importance of standing up to bullies and protecting the people you love. Linda welcomed us with open arms and no questions, though I could see the relief in her eyes when I finally told her the truth about what had been happening in my marriage. She'd been watching and waiting for years, ready to help when I was ready to accept it. I'm so proud of you, she said, hugging me tightly as Tyler carried our bags upstairs. I know this wasn't easy, but you're doing the right thing. That night, I called Patricia Chen to confirm that the papers would be served first thing in the morning. I also called Maria Santos, the social worker Dr. Henderson had recommended, and explained that I'd finally taken action to leave my abusive marriage. She praised my careful planning and offered resources for counseling and support as Tyler and I adjusted to our new circumstances. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. For the first time in years, I went to bed without worrying about accidentally triggering Marcus's anger or calculating how to avoid his physical intimidation. Tyler was safe in the room next door, and Linda was down the hall, and Marcus was hours away with no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to implode. Marcus called my phone at 7:30 the next morning, his voice tight with suspicion. "Where are you? Your car isn't in the driveway." "We're visiting Linda," I said calmly. "I mentioned it yesterday, remember?" There was a pause while Marcus apparently tried to recall a conversation that had never happened. "How long are you staying?" "I'm not sure yet. It depends on how things go." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear Marcus calculating, trying to determine if my absence was coincidental or connected to something he should be worried about. "I need you to come home today," he said, his tone shifting toward the authoritative voice he used when he expected compliance. "There are things we need to discuss." "What kinds of things?" I asked, though I suspected Marcus was responding to some instinct that warned him his control was slipping. "Marriage things, family things. We need to talk about Tyler's college plans and our budget for next year." The irony was almost laughable. Marcus wanted to discuss our family budget on the same day his secret financial life would be exposed in court documents. He was planning to manipulate me about college expenses while sitting on enough hidden assets to fund Tyler's education at any university in the country. "We can talk when I get back," I said. "I'm not sure when that will be. Rachel." His voice carried a warning now, the edge that had trained me to back down from countless conversations over the years. "I'm not asking you to come home. I'm telling you." For the first time in our marriage, his threatening tone had no power over me. "And I'm telling you that I'm staying in Portland for now. We'll talk when I'm ready." The silence that followed was electric with Marcus's rage. I could picture him standing in our kitchen, his face flushing with the kind of anger that had once sent me scrambling to apologize and comply. But I was 200 miles away, surrounded by people who cared about my well-being, and his anger couldn't reach me anymore. "You're making a mistake, Rachel," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "A big mistake." "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Patricia Chen to report the threatening phone call. She assured me that Marcus would be served within the hour and that his intimidation tactics would be documented as evidence of his abusive behavior. At 9:15, Patricia called to confirm that the papers had been delivered. Marcus had been served at his office in front of his employees and several clients. According to the process server, Marcus had gone white when he read the petition, then locked himself in his office and refused to speak to anyone. The divorce petition laid out everything: the hidden bank accounts, the secret property, the fraudulent insurance policy, the evidence of adultery, the pattern of domestic violence. Years of careful deception had been exposed in a single legal document that stripped away every lie Marcus had used to maintain his double life. Within hours, the court had granted our emergency motions. Marcus's accounts were frozen, preventing him from transferring any more assets to Amanda or anyone else. He was prohibited from disposing of marital property, including the rental property he'd hidden from me. Most importantly, he was served with a temporary restraining order that required him to stay away from Tyler and me until the court could hold a hearing on our safety concerns. Amanda called my phone that afternoon, her voice shrill with panic. "What did you do? Marcus is devastated. You've ruined everything for him." The audacity of his mistress calling to berate me for protecting myself from their theft and deception was breathtaking. "I documented the truth about what you two have been doing," I said calmly. "If that ruined your plans, maybe you should have made different choices." "You don't understand," Amanda continued, apparently oblivious to how her words sounded. "Marcus loves me. We were going to be together. You were just holding him back." "By being his wife?" I asked. "By believing his lies about our finances while you helped him steal from our marriage?" Amanda hung up without responding, but not before I'd recorded the entire conversation. Her admission that she and Marcus had been planning a life together, using marital assets, was additional evidence for our divorce case. Marcus tried calling my phone dozens of times that day, leaving voicemails that escalated from confusion to anger to threats. I saved every message, each one demonstrating the pattern of intimidation and control that had characterized our marriage. The mask had finally fallen away, revealing the man I'd been living with for years. The most chilling message came that evening. "You think you're so smart, Rachel. You think you've won something, but you have no idea what you've started. I know where Linda lives. I know Tyler's schedule. You can't hide forever." I immediately forwarded the message to Patricia Chen and called the police to report the threatening communication. The restraining order Marcus had been served specifically prohibited him from contacting Tyler or me, and his voicemails constituted criminal violations of that order. Tyler and I spent the next week in Portland while Patricia worked to strengthen our legal position. The forensic accountant she'd hired to trace Marcus's assets uncovered even more hidden accounts and undisclosed income. The scope of his financial fraud was staggering. Over the course of our marriage, he'd systematically diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from our joint resources to fund his secret life. The criminal investigation that followed revealed that Amanda had been more than just Marcus's mistress. She'd been his partner in bank fraud and money laundering. Both of them were arrested on charges related to their financial crimes, and the assets they'd stolen were recovered and returned to our marital estate. Tyler thrived during our time away from Marcus's influence. Color returned to his cheeks, and he started sleeping through the night again. He made friends with Linda's neighbors and spent hours playing with their dogs, activities that seemed to restore some of the childhood innocence that had been slowly eroding under his father's toxic presence. When we finally returned to Riverside, 3 weeks later, it was to a house that felt different without Marcus's oppressive energy filling the rooms. He'd been arrested and was awaiting trial, living with his parents and working construction jobs to pay his legal fees. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of our family's financial life was now struggling to afford basic necessities. His empire of lies collapsed around him. Tyler and I began the process of rebuilding our lives with honesty as our foundation. We talked openly about what had happened, about the warning signs we'd both noticed, about how to recognize and respond to manipulation and abuse. Tyler started therapy to process his experiences, and I continued working with Maria Santos to heal from years of psychological trauma. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, with Marcus receiving a small settlement after his legal obligations were met. The bulk of our marital assets remained with Tyler and me, along with the rental property that would fund Tyler's college education at whatever university he chose. Marcus's attempt to steal our future had ultimately secured it instead. His lies had been exposed, his assets recovered, and his ability to manipulate and harm us had been permanently severed by legal decree. On the anniversary of the day I'd first discovered his hidden bank accounts, I took Tyler out for dinner at an expensive restaurant I'd never been able to afford during my marriage. We ordered dessert and talked about his college plans, his dreams for the future, the life he wanted to build based on honesty and respect. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Tyler said as we shared chocolate cake, "for being brave enough to leave, for protecting us, for showing me what it looks like to stand up for yourself." Looking at my son, confident, secure, unafraid, I realized that leaving Marcus had given Tyler the most valuable gift possible, a model of how to respond when someone tries to diminish your worth or steal your power. He would never accept Marcus's behavior as normal, because he'd seen what it looked like to demand better. The woman who had once accepted accidents as inevitable had become someone who created her own safety and security. Marcus had taught me to expect pain from love, but Tyler and Linda and the team of professionals who'd helped me escape had taught me to expect respect, honesty, and genuine care. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who convinced you they were protecting you. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to stop believing their lies and start documenting their truths, you can break free and build something better from the pieces they tried to steal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.